What's up guys, Asian here, and this is going to be the first video in a series of videos originally made for Nevis and Atsona's ESO Academy. So that is a Discord where a bunch of endgame players, both experienced in PvE and in PvP, are kind of giving out advice, sort of like lecture series based on basically what we're all very good at, essentially. So we have a lot of high-end DPS players that are giving lessons and one-on-ones and sort of group lessons on how to be better DPS and etc. So this particular sort of next series of videos is geared more towards teaching people more or less the mathematics behind ESO, how we can use it to help guide our builds, and kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit, so to speak, on the actual theory crafting that a lot of endgame PvEers get involved in, at the very least on the DPS side of things. So all of this has been written up in our markdown. So for those of you guys who are not aware yet, for those of you guys who follow my channel for a long time, you guys know that I don't really consider myself a coder, but I do a lot of work in R, and specifically R Studio. So one of the benefits is with R is that I am able to hopefully GitHub and hopefully publish all of the code here. You would need R Studio in order to basically read the code itself and kind of get a page that looks like this, but all that stuff is free. R is an open source software, so it's all free to basically download, but basically everything, all of my lectures, hopefully will be publicly available relatively soon once I get a GitHub set up and things like that. But this is the first in the Math 101 lecture series, which again explores mathematics behind ESO. This particular lecture is just explaining the ability metric, which is probably the most important thing you're going to need to know if you intend on doing any sort of mathematics in ESO. Basically, all videos that are following this one in this lecture series basically refers back to the ability metric. So it's really important that we understand what it is, how we can use it, and what it's actually measuring. So we have a table of contents here. So introduction. Let me see if I can pull this up a little bit here. I'm sure blow it up. Open it here. There we go. Okay, here we go. So you can see here, introduction, going over the mathematics behind ESO. So hopefully I'll be able to, prove to you guys that the mathematics do make sense here. If you want to contact me with any specific questions, this is my Discord handle with the numbers at the end, so you can contact me through Discord. It should be open to everybody to contact me, regardless of whether we are friends or not. Let me know if it's not in the comment section below, and I'll try to change the appropriate settings. But what we're interested in is exploring what's called the ability metric. So this is the more or less a mathematical formulation that was explained first by a player called Asair back in the Homestead patch in 2017. So this is about 2 years ago. So basically, once 1 Tamriel came around, which was the patch I believe right before Homestead, the ability metric was published first in Tamriel Foundry and then also on the official forums, and it was kind of cleaned up a little bit in Homestead, and work, since Asair doesn't play anymore, the work has been continued by several other players, basically to kind of update the ability metric. Now the ability metric itself hasn't really changed all that much since Homestead. So this formula right here is the ability metric formula. Now we will note that I am using Magicka, spell damage, and spell crit. Just basically whenever I refer to this, that's just for consistency's sake. You can obviously substitute stamina, weapon damage, and weapon crit for all these values here, but just for consistency across all different lectures, we'll be sticking with Magicka, spell damage, and spell crit. So the ability metric is equal to what I like to call the effective max Magicka or effective max spell damage term. So that's Magicka plus 10.5 times your spell damage, or alternatively, it can be Magicka divided by 10.5 plus your spell damage, multiplied by the attacker bonus, and we'll explain what the attacker bonus actually it takes part of. There's actually quite a few things that are involved in the attacker bonus. Then we have our mitigation modifier, and then we have our what most people call the crit modifier, which is 1 plus your spell crit times your critical damage modifier. So first, effective max Magicka and effective spell damage. So this is the first term that we talked about right here. So this is the Magicka plus 10.5 times your spell damage. So the first term is what here, and then we can also use the alternative term, magicka divided by 10.5 plus spell damage. So this entire term, sometimes called the effective max magicka or effective spell damage, depending on which one you use. So if you're going to use the top version here, this is effective max magicka. This one here is effective spell damage. You will get different values from your ability metric depending on which term you use, but they are basically more or less equivalent to each other. So one of the big things that people always ask about is where does that 10.5 number come from? And that comes from what are called skill coefficients. So every skill in ESO basically has a formula to calculate out its tooltips. So this goes for light attacks, heavy attacks, any sort of weapon abilities. Basically everything in the game has some sort of formulation to calculate out your tooltip damage and the actual damage that you end up dealing out. So a lot of this has basically been data dredged. So these formulas that you will find, I do have a link to them here. If we go ahead and click on this link here, you'll find that we do go to the UESP website, and they do have basically the formulas for every single ability in the game, not just player abilities, but also NPC abilities as well. So first, let's take a look at what this is. So let's look at the formula for unstable wall of elements. So this is the description that you'll find on that UESP website. So you slam your staff down to yada 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 yada, and you will deal, in this case, a certain value of flame damage. You have some extra effects here, and then when the bear explodes, you deal another value of flame damage here. And in this instance, this first value, which we're calling A, it's called 1, so $1 here on the website, is equal to this formula. Now, this is an approximation, so if you do decide to plug in your magicka and spell damage, it's not going to match up exactly with what's in game, but it's a pretty close approximation to what's going on here. And then this is your second value, B here. So you notice that both magicka and spell damage has their own coefficients. So if you have your max magicka and spell damage, you can obviously plug it in. You can get your predicted values, which won't line up exactly with what you see in game, maybe due to rounding errors, or maybe the formula is a little bit off by a couple decimal points, but it should be pretty close. Now, if you decide to go into the UESP website, so let's open this in a different tab here. You'll notice, so let's go down to unstable wall, just so we're taking a look at the ability here. Material unstable wall of elements here. So you'll notice that here we have an R2 and a ratio. So the R2 is basically what's called the coefficient ratio, and that's basically more or less tells us how well this lines up with true in-game values. A lot of these are close to 1, but you can see here some of them aren't really close to 1. So this one is technically not 1, so you are going to get a little bit of variation here and there. But the ratio here refers to the ratio between the two coefficients here. So if we go back over here, so the ratio is going to be basically over here, it'd be this value 0.84 divided by 0.0798816. And that's what we call the ratio. So if we take a look at A, like I have here, you'll find that when we do this ratio, we get a value of 10.55. So this basically refers to the sort of max magicka to spell damage ratio here, because we have spell damage over max magicka. So this is basically saying that for every 10.55 max magicka that we have, it's effectively equivalent to 1 spell damage. So if we reduce this max magicka value here by 1055, for example, that would be the equivalent of reducing our spell damage by 100. And then this does check out if you decide to just play around with the values and just plug them in randomly. So here, example, I'm using fake values here. So let's say we have 2000 max magicka, 2000 spell damage. If we add in 1055 max magicka, this should be the equivalent of adding in 100 spell damage for this formula here. So we can see here that they're not exactly lining up. Again, you do have a couple of trailing decimal points here, but for all intents and purposes, this is the exact same value here. So the game would just truncate this, and you still get the 589 damage here for that value for A. So this is where you would get the 10.5 max magicka or max stamina is equal to 1 spell damage or 1 weapon damage. It's not going to be reflected on your actual spell damage or weapon damage value on your character sheet, but when you calculate it out in the tooltip value, that's where this comes back to. So that's basically effective X magic and effective spell damage. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about the attacker bonus. So Asair breaks down the attacker bonus terms into 3 different terms. So you have the CP bonus, your damage done modifier, and your damage taken modifier. And so each of these 3 values are multiplicative with each other, as you can see up here. So your CP bonus basically includes all your CP modifiers. So Thaumaturge, Master at Arms, Elemental Expert for magic DPS. For Stamina DPS, it would be Mighty, Thaumaturge, Master at Arms. As well as Staff Expert and Weapons Expert if you are Magic or Stamina respectively. So basically, your damage done modifier, which is the second term, includes anything that has the phrase increases your damage done or increases your damage dealt to the enemy. A good example of this would be Minor Berserk, which boosts your damage done to enemies by 8%. So you have that damage done wording in there. The damage taken modifier includes essentially anything in the phrase that says increases damage taken in its description. So that would be, for example, Minor Vulnerability, which boosts damage enemies take from your attacks by 8%. One of the best ways to think about it is that damage done modifiers, generally speaking, are going to be buffs to you, and damage taken modifiers are debuffs that are applied to the enemy. So things like martial knowledge, Zen's redress, those are debuffs that you apply to the enemy, and so those are damage taken, and it's kind of also reflected in the way that their 5-piece effects are worded, things like that. So these terms are multiplicative with each other, which means that as you stack more and more and more onto a single term, the actual effectiveness of the term that you're adding will be reduced, and that's just due to the mathematical nature. So 1 plus 0.05 plus 0.08, for example, that value is going to give you 1.13. But if you're multiplying the 0.05 and the 0.08 together, you're going to get a lesser value than 0.13. So that's kind of basically, it's not really what I would call diminishing returns, but it's just the nature of the multiplicative property of everything here. So when we include these modifiers in our calculations, we basically add the value to 1 after you divide them by 100. Basically, we're taking the percent value and turning it into a decimal value. So turning a percent to a decimal, you divide by 100. Turning a decimal to a percent, you multiply by 100. So if you want to add an 8% bonus, it would be 0.08, because 8 divided by 100 gives you that 0.08, and you add it to 1. So an example of this that I have here is if you have 13% from Elemental Expert, 20% from Master at Arms, 60% from Thaumaturge, your CP bonus would be equivalent to this. It would basically be 1 plus the 0.13 if you're a magic DPS. Then you have 0.2 times your direct damage proportion from your overall DPS. So that's, let's say 80% of your DPS is from direct damage abilities. This would be 0.8. And then 0.16 times the damage over time proportion of your DPS. So it'd be usually would be the 1 minus your direct damage proportion. So if your direct damage proportion is 80%, then your damage over time would be 20%. So this would be 0.2, for example. So you will have to take the proportion here, and that's kind of what I explained here. So if 40% of our total damage is from direct damage, then we will need to multiply this value here by 0.4 to get your true CP modifier from Master at Arms. Then obviously your damage done modifier, damage taken modifiers, those are pretty straightforward. You just basically add them all together. You have Berserk and Slayer are your most common damage done modifiers, and then damage taken you have Vulnerability, as well as things like Engulfing Flames, Morai Tong, Zens, and Martial Knowledge. So just again, take a look at whether it's a buff or a debuff. If it's debuff, it's usually going to end up being a damage taken modifier. If it's a buff, it's going to be a damage done modifier. The mitigation has its own sub-formula here, so this is the formula for mitigation here. So if we go ahead and break down each of these terms, resistance is pretty straightforward. That's basically just resistance of whatever it is you're hitting. So for PvP, it'd be whatever your physical spell resistance is. But for PvE, most dungeon and trial enemies, with the exception of Maelstrom Arena, have a value of 18,200 for both spell and physical resistance. For most overland enemies, which also includes world bosses, that value is halved down to 9,100 instead. So when we talk about reaching the pen cap of 18,200, that's really what we're talking about, basically getting through all the resistances that enemies have. Armor debuffs refer to flat decreases to enemy resistances that are considered debuffs. So Alkosh, Fracture, or Breach, those would be considered armor debuffs. Things like Crusher as well are also fall under armor debuffs. So this is just a flat decrease, but it has to be a debuff. So things like your light armor passive, for example, wouldn't fall under this because that's not a debuff. Percentage penetration refers to the unique passives that maces and mauls both have. So maces get 10% penetration for each mace that you have. Mauls just get an additional 20%. So these would be entered in as 0.1 and 0.2. So 1 minus, if you have 2 maces, for example, would be 1 minus 0.2, 0.1 plus times 2. So you can see here that these values, this percentage value is calculated out after we take into consideration all of armor debuffs, which is why we often say that maces and mauls are not very powerful compared to other weapon options. The assumption is that you are able to get things like Major Fracture, Minor Fracture, Alkosh, Crusher up times, so the actual amount of penetration that you're getting from maces is not going to be very powerful compared to what you would get from something like daggers, axes, or swords. Flat penetration refers to any bonuses that are not tied to debuffs. So this would be penetration you would get from like piercing or spell erosion, or the light armor passive, for example. And then finally, level times 1,000. So for level, for all PvE enemies, they are assumed to be level 50. Players are level 66. That's because we do have 16 extra levels that are given to us by our CPs. You get 1 extra level for every 10 CP that you get. This is kind of a carryover from VR ranks. For those guys who have been playing long enough to remember VR ranks, you basically got all the way up to VR 16 or 14, I believe it was. They added in 2 additional VR levels when they changed it over to CP. So player total level is 66. You have 50 total and then 16 extra from your CPs. So as an example of this, the amount of mitigation that you would have here from a, let's say, Trials boss, you have Major Breach, Alkosh, an infused non-Torx Crusher, and then you have additional 1,000 flat penetration from Spell Erosion. So we don't have any sort of percentage penetration. So we have 80,200. You subtract out the Major Breach. You minus out the Alkosh, you minus out the infused Torx Crusher. So this is this value here would be the resistance minus armor debuff. Then you subtract out your flat bonuses, so you have 1,000 and then 4884 from a light armor passive here. Then you divide this whole thing by 50 because we are fighting a PvE mob times 1,000, and we get a value of 0.03. 836. So we have a total mitigation of 3.8%. So just move the decimal point over by 2. And remember that from the ability metric, our value here would actually be 1 minus mitigation. It would be 1 minus this value here, and that would give us the total damage that we're actually doing. So it would be sitting a little bit over 96% of our damage here. Crit modifier is, again, pretty straightforward. It's only 2 terms you got to worry about, so crit chance and crit damage. Crit chance is basically your probability of critting. Crit chance is something you get straight from your character sheet. There's a value also that's a bit confusing called critical rating. So that would be something from like your armor bonus. So a critical bonus from an armor set bonus would be 833, for example. Basically, if you divide that value by 219, that is equal to about 1% crit chance. So Major Prophecy provides 2190 spell critical rating. This is equivalent to 10% additional spell crit. Critical damage is not on your base game character sheet. You will usually need some sort of add-on to figure it out, but you can also just add it up for yourself. So this value is basically how much additional damage that your critical hits deal compared to non-critical hits. So the base value here is 50% additional damage, so that would be 0.5. So you have Minor Force, Major Force, that provides buffs. Your Shadow Mundus provides buffs to this, and CB passives also provide buffs through Elfborn and Precise Strikes. So you can get this value to be over 100%, so you would be dealing basically more than double your normal damage on a critical hit, for example. But you are capped out at 100% crit chance. If you think about it, it's basically the chance that your hit will be a crit. So if you're getting 150% crit chance, it's just saying that you're critting at 100%. So crit chance is maximized at 100%. So while you can, in theory, get over 100% crit chance, it'll just be floored all the way back down to 1. So an example of our crit modifier would be, let's say we have minor force, we were using the shadow mundus with all divines for a total of 90% additional crit damage. We're a Khajiit, so we get another 10% additional critical damage, and we have 60% crit chance. Our crit modifier would be 1 plus 0.6, which is our crit chance here, 60% crit chance, times we have your base modifier 0.5, you have minor force, you have your shadow mundus, and you have your Khajiit passive here, and you get 1.534. So this is basically all the breakdowns here. So you have your crit mod, your mitigation, your attacker bonus, and your effective max magic effective spell damage. And that all boils down to your actual value here. So now that you have your ability metric, what can you do with it? Well, the first thing I want to point out is that this is only an approximation to what the actual in-game value is, and while it has an association with overall damage, it shouldn't be used as a direct representation of DPS. So you'll find that I often say that it is a proxy for DPS, and that's basically what you should be using it for. It's a proxy, some sort of value that we can basically standardize and compare against other values. This is not going to be reflective of DPS. So let's say you make a couple of changes to your builds and you see 10% increase to your ability metric. That does not automatically mean that you're going to get 10% additional DPS compared to what you had prior, but it is a pretty good approximation, and so it's a pretty good proxy for DPS. So one thing that we do for ability metric is we use it to calculate out percentage differences. So basically what we do is we take two different scenarios, we basically calculate out the ability metrics, and then we compare them to each other. So the percentage change is basically final minus initial, this entire term divided by initial times 100. And if you do a little bit of algebra here, you can divide out initial to these two terms. You get final minus divided by initial minus 1 times 100. This will give us our percentage change. So you can basically figure out how much your ability metric is changing, and then you can take that and be like, okay, we can see approximately this much of an increase or decrease in damage based on the changes that we make here. So here's an example here of what you can do here. So this example here, let's say we're changing our mundus from the shadow to the thief, and we're interested in seeing whether this results in a DPS increase here. So the only thing that we're changing here is our mundus. So we don't need to worry about our effective max magic, don't need to worry about mitigation, don't need to worry about our attacker bonus. So because of this, we can basically say, okay, these terms are equal to each other, so we can basically ignore all those terms. It's kind of the same thing with math. If you have a plus b divided by a, or say you have some value a times b divided by a times b plus 1, you have a's on both the top and the bottom, so you can just basically say, okay, if you divide them out, they equal 1, so you can just get rid of the a's, so you're only interested in the b and the b plus 1 term, for example. So here, because we're only changing our crit modifier, that's the only thing that we're changing. So you can just take a look at that. If we're doing things like adding in a different set, so for example, let's say you want to compare Mother Sorrow to Julianos, then you would need to include all the values that have been changing here. So that would be your spell crit modifier as well as your spell damage. So basically you would just take those two terms, you would ignore attacker bonus, you would ignore the mitigation bonus here. So in this example, we're just worried about the crit modifier. So we're only changing our mundus stone. And so we're going to use the assumption that we have 60% crit chance and 99% crit damage using the shadow with 7 divines. So when we change that out for the thief, we get 80% crit damage, and we increase our crit chance to 70.6%. So basically we take a look at our two crit values. So we have thief as our final, and we have shadow as our initial. Then we subtract 1. So this is again the percentage change value here. So we're just taking our crit modifier and replacing it for our final and our initial values here. Subtracting 1 out, multiplied by 100, and we get our percentage change. You can see here that by changing from the shadow to the thief, we're going to get a 1.8% DPS loss if we have these values right here. So we can see here that it is going to be DPS loss. It's only approximation, so about 1.8% DPS loss. So it's in our best interest to stick with the shadow rather than the thief in this scenario. You can repeat this for any sort of changes that you're interested in making with your build. So the conclusion here, it's kind of, sorry, it's a little bit shadowed here, so let me just move where I am. You guys can see it. But the conclusion basically is that we've broken down the various components of the ability metrics. We've kind of shown how you can use it to basically compare different builds with each other. So again, I reiterate here that it is important to keep in mind the limitations that we have with the ability metric. It cannot directly take in consideration flat damage bonuses like proc damage, so things like Reliquin and other sort of sets like that. A little bit difficult to calculate out for with the ability metric just because it doesn't take those into consideration. I will show you how you can actually use the ability metric and proc damage to kind of figure it out. That's going to be on a separate lecture series. And again, the ability metric is not the same thing as DPS. They're both correlated with each other, they are associated with each other, but you can't say ability metric equals DPS. You can only say it's an approximation. So you can't really just say, oh, like for this example up here, oh, you'll see a minus 1.8%, you'll see a 1.8% decrease in DPS. Not really the case here. It's a rough approximation, so you can see about a 1.8% decrease in DPS or an approximately 1.8% decrease in DPS. Again, it's not an exact one-to-one kind of exchangeability here, but it's a close enough approximation that most Theorycrafters will essentially use this value here to say, yeah, you'll see a 1.8% decrease in DPS, even though that's not truly accurate here. But that's pretty much it for this first lecture. So this is kind of the basis behind the rest of our lectures here. So we will refer back to the ability metric quite a few times here. So this is definitely something that you're going to want to learn before you start getting into any sort of theory crafting. But that pretty much covers it for this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. Again, let me know if you guys have any questions either here in the comment section or you can contact me directly on Discord. I will have a link to a GitHub where you'll be able to download the actual R Markdown code that I used to write this up, or of course you can just refer back to this video. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.